The most popular attack pattern is a supply chain attack. Why do you think that is?
Because it's easier to hack a person than it is to hack a computer.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Agents Hour. And with us, we have Ismail from Superagent. So Ismail, I know you've been on the show before. First, what's Superagent? And then we'll talk about Security Corner.
Yeah, so Superagent helps companies stay secure and safe, especially now when you have attackers that leverage the same AIs we do to attack prone and basically exfiltrate a bunch of data and then, ask for money from big companies to get that data back. Because when you have your code public, every bug that you've ever had in that code is public. Previously, it took an army of attackers and weeks of work to actually prone and find those bugs and then chain them together in a way where you could actually attack something. But nowadays, it takes an hour. And you don't even need to use frontier models. You don't even need to have access to Mythos or GPT 5.5. You can use a smaller open source model, Kimi 2.6. It does the job as well as any of these other models, given that you know what you're doing. And most people that are out there trying to actually do harm know what they're doing. So that's a reality. And I'm going to be talking a bit about, what we see and what type of attack vectors we see when we are working with our customers, and also a bit about what you can do as a developer or an open source maintainer or a security person in general. What we see today, and I think this was also pretty obvious last week when we had this mini Shai-Hulud attack that basically took over hundreds of packages across npm, pypi, etc., right? So those attacks usually start, it's either that someone in an organization or a contributor or someone with access to a project, privileges in a project, gets basically phished. Most of these attacks start by somebody getting phished, either through an email. It could be through a DM on X. I've received a bunch of those. Hey, I'm from TechCrunch. I want to write an article. Here's my cal.com link. You press on it, and all of a sudden, you're hacked. And then it escalates from there. So phishing is a very typical scenario where these attacks start. And I think we see that as well in the type of attacks where they have access to tokens that usually a person wouldn't have access to, right? Where did they get that access? It's not stored in the code. So it's a very common pattern that we see. The problem with phishing is that it's very hard to defend against because they are getting extremely sophisticated. Previously, you could look at the domain of the email sender, right? And you could figure it out. Or if something was off, you would get a feel for it. Nowadays, you don't even see that. And I think that, these email providers have basically dropped the ball on, trying to filter out those type of emails. And so you should be very, very cautious when getting emails from either npm, GitHub, or any of these services where you have these credentials that you don't want to get exposed, right? So that's the first primary thing that I think that people miss. In the age of AI, they think that the AI just figures out how to get the token. And in some cases, that is true. But in most cases, I would guess that it's just phishing, right? And it's very hard to protect against. I myself have a small bot that I run on as a Chrome extension in my Gmail that just runs a secondary check on all the outbound links in an email I get, just to get a feel for, is this sus in any way, right? It doesn't catch everything, but it works quite well, especially for those emails that actually get through the spam filter. So that's one thing that I recommend highly, build something that can, just check, your emails twice before actually clicking on anything. The second attack vector we see is projects that have outdated CI/CD workflows. Before AI, that wasn't that big of a problem because you needed to create a very sophisticated attack in order to exfiltrate anything. But nowadays, people run a bunch of agents in their CI/CDs as well, right? which then you need to be extra careful exactly what type of code you actually have in those workflows. So that's something that we see a lot as well, where people just have misconfigured repositories or CI/CD workflows where these tokens can either leak or where the attacker can chain different vulnerabilities together in order to exfiltrate something and then, publish a malicious version of some package somewhere, right? And usually I would say that they don't start off with these huge packages. They start off with something much smaller that's used across the supply chain without anybody really thinking about it. Some dependency you might have somewhere that you just, take for granted is secure, right? And it's maintained by some dude that does it once a month, and then that ships an update. You install the update, and then you have that, and then the whole supply chain has it. Depending on, it's just exponential depending on how many downloads a certain supply chain package has. In that case, my recommendation is doing two very specific things. First is to always, run a check on your CI/CD workflows. Always try to, stay updated with, what's best practice and what's not best practice. And there are many ways of doing that. You can download a skill that is specifically for like CI/CD security that you can use. You can run Codex or Cloud Code on it or whatever. But having that as a routine or a job that gets done every now and then, I think is very helpful. And the second thing is, of course, like dependencies, right? I think that many people still rely on npm as their package manager. I think that those people need to start thinking about migrating to other package managers, such as pnpm, where you have some level of configuration on, when you can update a dependency, how that update actually is done, and also what type of like exotic lifecycle hooks you want to allow into your project, right? I see a comment and then we get hacked by the skill. Yeah, that's also an issue. You should definitely, be wary about the skills you use as well, especially if you're running agents in the CI/CD workflow. I wouldn't be like as worried about that if I'm running it through my Cloud Code or something like that, because Cloud Code has pretty good guardrails built in. They work a lot, and Codex as well with those type of things. But it can happen, and you need to be wary about, what you're doing, how your setup looks like, what environment variables you have exposed in your systems. That could be locally, that could be in the cloud, that could be in a GitHub action. You need to understand that people are actively using this technology to try to figure out what type of bugs you have, how they can chain them together in order to exploit, a vulnerability. That's the thing that people need to really take into account and build workflows around.
One thing that I've seen some of our users do, and I just want to know your perspective on this. I do know some of the larger organizations that use Mastra and of course, other packages. They have some kind of timeline where they won't actually even install a package unless it's X number of days old. The thought being that if there was a massive security issue, it would be caught within the first day or 2 or 3. And as long as they have that policy in place, it gives them some level. Of course, nothing's perfect, but maybe it gives them a slight bit of protection from the very blatant things that might slip through.
I think it's good. I think it's a shame that you have to do that. And I think that it's good for the organization, but I think it's detrimental to open source. Because what will end up happening is that people will never, if you're a new person on the block trying to get your open source project to scale. I think Amjad from Replit posted this on LinkedIn a while back. I don't think people are willing to install that package anymore. And I think that in 6 months, nobody, especially not enterprises, will be keen on installing new packages. And what ends up happening is that you get this Darwinian GitHub where only the larger packages that have the security posture and have, the millions of dollars to spend on tokens to secure their project, only those will survive in the end. And that's really bad for many reasons. That's a threat to open source, unfortunately. But from an enterprise perspective, I think that it's a good thing to do. And I think pnpm has this built in, right? So you can just enable that setting and go from there, more or less.
I would say the most popular attack pattern is a supply chain attack these days. Why do you think that is?
Because it's easier to hack a person than it is to hack a computer. And hacking a person it's just a phishing email away. And then you have access. And then the actual attack itself is usually very simple. It's just a lifecycle hook somewhere, a post-install script, a pre-install script. So, all of these scanners that you see, socket.dev and similar, they catch them, instantly more or less because they're so simple, the attacks. It's just a post-install script to some other script that then does something that it shouldn't do, right? Something they call an exotic lifecycle hook. We see other ways people do it as well. And that is more complex, where they actually try to find bugs in the code without having to update anything, right? Find bugs in the code and then chain those bugs together, basically, in order to get a full exfiltration path in a older version of some supply chain package that has 100 millions of downloads a week. That's also a way to do it. And that one is much harder to catch. So I think from a maintainer perspective, you need to adopt these tools. You need to have some kind of leverage against these attackers. The problem is the cost. That's where I see a discrepancy between the attacker and the defender, right? And not everyone has $1 million to put in different type of automation workflows, right? And so that becomes a huge problem for open source.
If we keep getting these types of attacks, I think, especially bigger companies that have employees, let's say, they'll stop using open source. They'll just have Claude rewrite these modules themselves. There is no supply chain risk if it's your own supply chain, and maybe that's another vector for them. But if big companies keep getting exploited and then taken hostage, all of us open source developers are screwed because no one will trust us at all. Or they'll just go rebuild it from scratch, point Claude at our repos, and then just rewrite all of them.
And the challenge there is also, this is actually good for model companies because then everyone is responsible for, one, generating their own dependencies, and then security checking their own dependencies. And they're burning lots of tokens to basically reuse something that already exists. And you could have already security checked, but if the supply chain is the weakness, it's harder to prevent against that attack maybe because you're, as you said, you're one human weakness away, one clicked email away from potentially compromising, a large supply chain.
Yeah, and everything that we use was built on open source, everything. So it's a real shame that the thing that actually created the thing is destroying the thing, right?
Yeah.
It's just so meta. But I think that what Shane is saying is already happening. You already see people, rewriting, not only because of security reasons, but also performance reasons. If you can write, some kind of utility package you have and make it twice as fast, and that could save you, I don't know how much of compute, why not, right? But it becomes a huge issue, I think. And I think that nobody understands what that will mean in the future for open software. It will basically be a cataclysmic event for open software. I think the only way to solve it is for open source to come together and find a way where we can help each other keep each other's supply chain secure and help each other with compute if that's necessary, or any other means where we can actually make our security posture as a whole better. It won't be enough to just have one, maintainer do it. You need the whole supply chain to do it in order for it to work. I'm a bit pissed actually, because I would expect companies such as GitHub or companies such as npm that have these registries to do more. They have money, they are huge companies, and they have profited from open source for a very long time. And I feel like it's time for them to step up, not by giving tokens to people, but by just making their pipelines more secure, right? Do better checks on stuff that comes in. But it seems like they're on manager mode or something. I'm not sure what's going on in these organizations, but it will be a huge problem for open source, definitely.
Do you have any other, tips that people, whether you're managing an open source project or whether you're using open source, things that you should look out for that we didn't already cover?
So I think that what you definitely should do, at least if you're a JavaScript developer, you should definitely use pnpm. you should definitely look at the settings that the new pnpm version has when it comes to updating your dependencies. That is a must. It costs nothing. Just do it, right? Costs 10 minutes of your time to have Claude migrate from npm to pnpm. The second thing I would do is that I would enable all of the security scanning software that's out there. So you have CodeQL from GitHub. It's free if you're open source. You have Dependabot, you have Socket or similar apps that you can run on your GitHub repository. Superagent has one as well. It's free. All of them are free for open source, so it won't cost you anything. I would also look into using, similar to how you use Codex when you write code, I would also look into using some agent that is actually an offensive adversarial tester of your code, not just the scanner, because scanning usually doesn't chain different bugs together in order to exploit it, right? But looking into those kind of agents as well, those are usually not free, but I think it makes a lot of sense if you want to do a mini Steinberger setup for yourself where it doesn't cost you $1 million, but it keeps your stuff secure from the most obvious bugs that could be exploited in a chain, right? And, we have some of that at Superagent. So you can just go to superagent.sh and download the stuff for free on your repository. One more thing that I would do is that I would be very cautious with who is contributing to my repository. And there are some solutions to that as well. There's something called Vouch, which you can use. It's open source, where you basically vouch a couple of contributors that you trust, that you have vetted yourself, and they can contribute, and the rest can't, more or less, or they can, but they're not vouched for. So you see that in your repository. And also, I think that there are a couple of other apps like that as well, where you can have a contributor trust profile, more or less, in order to not get a good PR the first time, but then a malicious one the second time that you miss or that Codex misses or whatever.
I've seen some projects just turn off PRs from outside contributors. You can only, open up issues, which once again is not great for open source software, but whatever.
We all started off somewhere, right? We all started off contributing to the projects we use and we love. Now we can't do that anymore because we are not vouched for. That again becomes like a thing that will be detrimental to open source. So there are a bunch of different attacks happening on open source right now. It's from the maintainer side. It's even from, I would say, some security companies are attacking open source as well, because they have these intelligence feeds that are open source, where you see all the vulnerabilities in all the packages. And if I haven't updated, maybe I missed the feed or something, right? Then I'm vulnerable, and that's exposed to any attacker out there. So even that is a problem for maintainers. So they're getting attacked from everywhere. Yeah, so it's a hard thing right now.
Yeah, I think we are definitely in a bit of a battle. I think security is it's always been hard. It's not becoming easier with AI. Attackers have the same tools that, we have, and they are able to use it to, potentially take advantage of certain vulnerabilities, whether it's supply chain or otherwise. But Ismail, thanks for coming on to Agents Hour, having a good discussion. What's the best way for folks to stay in touch, see what you're all doing over at Superagent?
Superagent.sh or superagent-AI on X. Feel free to reach out. That's the best way.
Dude, did you subscribe?
Dude, I host the show. Did you subscribe?
Did you subscribe?
Subscribe to Agents Hour every Monday, noon Pacific.